Asha tweeted and was just saying a bunch about pride and how proud she was of this team. Have you kind of had similar emotions the last couple days, and how do you balance that with a very painful ending to the season?
Nobody expected it in the BA and WW, a player who struggled to maintain her spot on the roster during her first 2 seasons, doubting each shot she took and privately worrying that she would be freed today. Then, almost overnight, everything changed. Not only did Lexie Hull experience the biggest shift she became one of the most fascinating stories in women's basketball history. And now, following years at the center, she has finally recounted her experiences with the Caitlin Clark Hurricane. Not the polished media version, but the real one. Furthermore, nobody truly expected what she revealed. You have to understand where Lexie Hull was before Caitlin Clark. It doesn't make sense to enter Gainbridge Fieldhouse before any of this. Hull was chosen by the Indiana Fever. With the 2022 draft's 6th overall pick on paper, that sounds like a dream. Top 10 options: a Stanford graduate with 3 All-Pac-12 selections, a national championship, the Class Award, and an Elite 90 award for both athletic and intellectual excellence in her final year. This was intended to be the launchpad. Instead, because of the adverse conditions, it turned into a grind that most outsiders never really noticed. During those formative years, not quite as good. They alternated between losing seasons and were among the worst teams in the league, and losing out on the playoffs entirely. But Ann Hull found herself in a situation that no young athlete wants to be in, trying tirelessly to stay on the team. Every single night was important. Each item was crucial in an unhealthy manner. She knew she was acting scared. Over her career, she averaged less than 5 points per game. The initial 2 seasons. During her second year, she played for about 20 minutes every night, although she was only able to earn 4.6 points. The numbers are correct. Something was holding her back, and Hull would finally figure it out. Few athletes are ever willing to discuss those early years in public, but she did. When I first started, it felt like, if I shoot, it must go in because otherwise I would get benched or I might be cut, she told Glamour magazine. Read that again: a top 10 draft pick, a Stanford graduate, and someone with extraordinary credentials is lying awake, genuinely fearing that a single missed opportunity could end her career. That was the reality of being on a losing team with nothing to ease the pain. She admitted that those first years were incredibly nerve-wracking: losing culture, no playoffs, no margin for error. The stakes were too high to overcome. Consequently, everything mattered. Moreover, that kind of pressure has an impact on more than just your shot. It gets into your head. It changes the way you move and think, the way you breathe while you play. Hull was being suffocated, and nobody outside was noticing the temperature. But something happened that changed. Not just Lexie Hull's career, but also the team's entire trajectory, and potentially the state of American women's basketball as a entire. The Indiana Fever selected Caitlin Clark as the first overall pick in the 2024 WNBA draft. In case you need a reminder, here is a quick synopsis of Caitlin Clark's character at the time. The NCAA's most decorated scorer. History of basketball, irrespective of gender, player who had broken records dating back decades, changed Iowa Hawkeyes games. Turned Big Ten women's basketball into a must-watch sport by turning it into sellouts and national television spectacles. Occasion. The WNBA as a whole was going to see whether the excitement surrounding her, which had never been witnessed for a female basketball player, was sincere. Was sincere. Her first season's unprecedented fan interaction and production confirmed her status as the most important player in the league. Suddenly, the Indiana Fever appeared as the most watched, discussed, controversial, and highly regarded team in the WNBA. There was a media frenzy everywhere they went. Both national broadcasts and sold-out audiences. Caitlin Clark put on that Indiana Fever tee. Everything came together. And Lexie Hull was present for every second of it. When discussing the effects, they seldom ever talk about Caitlin Clark's impact on her teammates. There were other factors besides visibility. Larger crowds, sponsorship agreements, and the cameras that followed them weren't the only factors. Regarding Lexie Hull, the biggest change was something that happens throughout a game inside the lines unless it's almost imperceptible, yet you know what you're looking at, in contrast to almost everyone who has ever played this game. On the floor, Caitlin Clark has a distinct viewpoint. Because of her remarkable passing, coaches fantasize about her court vision and the way she attracts defenders to her unobstructed, wide-open perimeter shooters in their path. For someone like Lexie Hull, who had been torturing herself over each time a shot was made for 2 years, Hull's explanation of the transition takes into account what came before it. On a fresh interpretation, after Clark came, she said, "I know I'm going to get open shots. However, since I've put a lot of effort into, I'll accept the outcome. Therefore, I don't need to worry about whether they enter or not." That's not just confidence, that's freedom. The type of freedom that is only achievable when the pressure valve is eventually made available. And the numbers backed it up. In 2024, Hull's three-point percentage was 47.1%, an all-time high that was among the best shooting performances in the league that year. Without Clark's help, her three-point percentage dropped back to 36. Passing, creating those chances 0.7%, precisely where she had been when attending college. The statistics tell the narrative even more effectively than the words. But this story grows much more fascinating when you take into account that the transformation wasn't exclusive to the court. This is because what? The off-court development of Lexie Hull and Caitlin Clark caused debate. Became one of the most talked about friendships in women's sports after making headlines. Fans were really curious in how Clark would adjust to being drafted into a locker room full of strangers. Gabby Marshall and Kate Martin. During her 4 years at Iowa, she was closest to 2 of her childhood teammates and a space where everyone else. When she came in Indiana, she was the new face of the franchise, having already established contacts. The concern was real. Would she fit in well? Would her interest insult the present players, or would they embrace her? And this is what actually happened. She was pulled to Lexie Hull almost immediately. They were lounging off the court in Indianapolis at the conclusion of that inaugural campaign. They were laughing as though they had been friends for years, experimenting with various beverages and sharing videos on TikTok. Over the Olympic vacation, WNBA, they traveled to Mexico. There was no doubting the chemistry, and fans adored it. However, by 2025, the dynamic had reached such to the point when its name was entirely different. When Sophie Cunningham joined the duet, it became a trio. Was dealt to Indiana prior to the 2025 season during the offseason. Hull, Cunningham, and Clark, the trio, started calling themselves the Traceleches, and their collective output became some of the league's most amusing and well-liked stuff. Hull and Cunningham were Clark's well-known caddies at an LPGA Pro-Am event. On social media, they were always making fun of one another. When Clark posted images from Fever Media Day to Instagram with Hull mocked Clark's lack of sun exposure in response to the remark, "We are so back." In one, he told People magazine. One of the more hilarious comments made throughout the offseason was that Clark might gain from having a young son as well. It was the kind of teasing that only happens in friendships where both people are genuinely comfortable with each other. It also gave the WNBA fanbase something they had never really seen, a close-up view of the players' individuality. Additionally, Hull declared that Clark will be present for her wedding, which has been scheduled since. In April 2025, Hull and Will Matheson, a former pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates, became engaged. Prior to being chosen in the 6th, the two initially met in the 2019 MLB draft. Matheson was a standout baseball player at Stanford. The fact that he retired from baseball due to a string of injuries and relocated to Indianapolis to be with Hull, various illnesses, reveals a lot about the basis of her life. Even though everything has been enjoyable, Hull chose to face a side of playing with Caitlin Clark in a manner that most people in her stance would have been disregarded or avoided entirely. And it's the part of this story that deserves the most attention. The 2025 WNBA season was one of the most divisive in the league's history. Hull described the arrival of Clark as possessing a certain attitude, a seriousness, a focus, and an edge that showed she was ready and had finished adjusting to take control. Hull told reporters before to the start of the season that Clark was obviously different going into the second year. There's a clear sense that she's here and ready to do business, according to Hull. That read seemed to be quite right at first. The best basketball was being played by Hull. Of her career through the first 7 games of 2025, leading the WNBA and averaging over 10 points each game. At 55.6% in the three-point percentage AT last, the Fever seemed to be a coherent team. Then the injuries started. Clark's quad issue caused him to miss multiple games. Then there was an issue with the groin. There was another soft tissue after that. Problem on July 15th. One of the season's most tragic events took place when Clark was injured on the sidelines for the fourth time in a matter of months during a game against the Connecticut Sun after making every effort and observing. When it broke apart, Clark seemed to be holding back her tears as she got up from the ground and leaned her forehead against the basket stanchion.